If you've ever taken a photo or video and in post, you found that as you boosted the exposure, there's a ton of noise, even though you shot with a low ISO. In this video, we're gonna go over why that is and how to fix it. All right, so maybe you've heard a concept that shooting with low ISO will be better to remove the noise in your final image, and that's not always the case. So ISO is basically the setting in your camera that boosts the signal or the amount of light digitally instead of optically. Your lens has an aperture and it lets more light in or less light in depending on if you open or close it. The ISO or gain in your camera boosts that signal to bring up that exposure in camera, but it's a digital aspect of what it's doing, so it can introduce more noise in your image. The common misunderstanding though is to lower your ISO even if it means that you're not exposing the image properly in camera, because you can always boost that in post. And I'm gonna show you why that is actually the reason you're still getting very grainy images even though you're shooting with a lower ISO. So to explain this, I'm gonna just show a simple graph here on screen, and we're gonna load up what is the proper exposure, what is called the noise floor, and then an ISO level as well. The noise floor is something that is at the very bottom, darkest area of your image and typically resides in the dark areas of your shots. And it's just basically the amount of noise that the sensor is going to produce, whether the ISO is high or low. There's still noise there. You might not be able to see it, but it's there. If you drop the ISO down in camera low and underexpose your image, as you bring the exposure up in post, what that does is it drags that noise floor up with your exposure. It goes 1-to-1 ratio of where your ISO was and the exposure was on the image, and it will bring it up in post, and it will fully blow out your image with a ton of noise that you didn't think was there because you used a low ISO. The best way of using ISO is to boost your ISO in camera to get the proper exposure, and when you do so, that noise floor will start to come up a little bit, but it won't come up at the same intensity level as it would if you lowered your ISO and brought it up in post. Now, in extreme cases, you're still gonna get a lot of noise in your image if you have a really low lit scene and you have to use a ton of ISO on your camera. You're not gonna get away with not having a lot of noise unless you have a camera sensor that is very sensitive in low light. So now I've gone through the little animation of kind of where the noise floor is. Let me show you a couple examples. So here I shot just a color chart against a dark black wall on a shelf. This first image here is using 3200 ISO and exposing it properly in camera with a f2.8 aperture. And even at 3200 ISO, you can see a little bit of noise from the 32 ISO, not a ton, and definitely manageable. In this next image, I have a shot that is boosted the exposure and white balance. That's all I adjusted in the image. And this was shot at 100 ISO, but was extremely underexposed in camera. And you can really tell, especially along the wall and just the shadow areas, there's a ton more noise in your image and a lot less detail in color and sharpness and everything because you underexposed the image in camera and used less ISO. So that's a good example of where using a lower ISO, even though you're underexposing, is not the right way to do it. So with those examples, hopefully you see that using ISO is not necessarily a bad thing in your images. Obviously, the first thing you want to do when adjusting exposure in your camera is adjust your aperture if you need it to go as wide as possible to let as much light in, and then even lowering your shutter speed to bring more light in as well. Sometimes with moving subjects, you can't go very low with your shutter speed, so that's when you need to start using some ISO in your camera. And I find that if you use ISO to expose the image properly in camera, you're really going to be okay with the amount of noise that these cameras are producing. They're not overly obnoxious looking, so I think the noise out of camera is really not bad, but it gets really, really nasty when you try to use lower ISO and underexpose that image and bring it up in post. So I would advise just find the right exposure in your camera using the exposure pyramid of aperture, shutter speed, and ISO. And don't be afraid to go to higher ISOs, especially in today's world with the cameras that we have. The sensors are fantastic and they really don't produce a ton of noise unless you're underexposing and doing things improperly. So that's it for this video. Hopefully you got something out of it. And if you liked it, hit the like button, hit the subscribe button as well for more videos like this every week. And until next time, guys, I'll see you in the next one.